Effects of motivational interviewing intervention on blackouts among college freshmen. This research was conducted by Kazemi, Levine, Jomkowski, Niles, and Sun. We first start by looking at the research problem. So we see that the first 6 to 8 weeks of college carry high drinking and drug use for freshmen. So it's during this time that they are more likely to engage in high-risk behaviors. Such high-risk behaviors can result in sexual victimization, unplanned pregnancies, suicide, and blackouts. We see that the purpose for Kazemi and colleagues conducting this study was to determine whether motivational interviewing is a beneficial technique in reducing blackout rates among college freshmen. So how is this significant and relevant to nursing? We see that we as nurses are the ones who provide care for these individuals. More often than not, blackouts result in a trip to the emergency room. And we see that it's at this location where they are treated by nurses for their alcohol and drug toxicity. We also see that outside of the hospital in the community setting, community nurses interact with college freshmen on a daily basis. It is important for community nurses to know how to work with this population of students engaging in these high-risk drinking behaviors. The research questions. So Kazemi and colleagues based their research on 2 questions. 1, is there a reduction in blackouts over 6 months while participating in the MI program? And 2, is there an association between the prevalence of blackouts and changes, such as a reduction, in the consumption of alcohol and drugs by freshman college students based on race and gender? This was a longitudinal study, meaning that it was started at baseline and conducted for 6 months. When looking at the research model, we see that there is no explicitly defined research model throughout Kazemi and colleagues' study. Although what we do know is that the motivational interviewing, which is the intervention, is modeled after the MI harm reduction alcohol skills training approach. As with any study, we have our research variables. We start looking at the independent variables, and that's the motivational interviewing. Then we look at the dependent variables, which is the blackout rates among college freshmen. Kazemi and colleague were looking for the link between the independent and dependent variables. Then we have research variables. These are any variables that could have potentially affected the results of the study. For example, the cognitive, behavioral, and developmental factors of all of the sample participants. So what exactly is motivational interviewing? Well, we see that it's a non-judgmental, empathetic, directive yet non-confrontational, person-centered approach. What motivational interviewing really centers on is embracing the student's own willingness to commit to change throughout their lives. It is ran by traditional interventionists, which in this study were graduate students. 50-minute individual therapy sessions was how the motivational interviewing was conducted. We see that the first session was done at baseline, the second session was done at 2 weeks, and then there was booster sessions that were both done at 3 and 6 months. When we're looking at the convenience sample, we see that that is how Kazemi and colleagues selected their study. The setting was at a public college in a southern state. Prior to consideration of inclusion and exclusion criteria, we see that there were 300 potential participants. After consideration of inclusion and exclusion criteria, we see that there were 188 students participating in the study. With conclusion of the study, we still had 188 students. That means that there was a 0% attrition rate. Inclusion and exclusion criteria. So with the inclusion criteria, that everyone had to be of freshman status between the age of 18 and 20. They had to have full-time enrollment. They had to have consumption of alcohol within the last 30 days, and they had to read and speak the English language fluently. Exclusion criteria consisted of any individual who did not meet those parameters. Ethics. The institutional review board approval prior to conduction of the study was had by Kazemi and his colleagues. Also, there was written and verbal informed consent with participants. Everyone who participated in the study was made aware of the willingness to participate in the study. Looking at data collection, we start with the Government Performance and Results Act. This really set the baseline by looking at gender, social interaction, unprotected sexual activity, and alcohol or drug use. The daily drinking questionnaire looked at the alcohol consumption patterns, such as the number of drinks consumed and the frequency at which these drinks were consumed. Then we look at the Rutgers Alcohol Problem Index. This looked at the social and emotional repercussions related to alcohol consumption. Also, it analyzed the health repercussions, such as blackouts. Upon conclusion of the study, we look at the results. So we see that 76 people reported experiencing blackouts at baseline, which dropped to 30 people at 6 months. We see that the average number of drinks also declined from 11.1 to 7.3. The average time spent drinking at baseline was 7.6 hours, and at 6 months was 5.5 hours. We see that the average drinking days at baseline was 6 days, and at 6 months was 4.4 days, also showing a decrease. There was no correlation between the average max number of drinks. We see that at baseline there was 3.5 drinks consumed as an average number of max, and that maintained consistency to 3.5 at 6 months. We see that race and gender showed no link between blackouts. So the researchers interpreted that the MI program had an impact on the participants' alcohol consumption and their rate of blackouts. As with any study, we experienced study limitations. In this study, because it was only conducted at one Southern college, the findings cannot be generalized to a broader population. It was a self-selected sample, so we worry about the randomization. There was also a lack of a control group, which would have been beneficial. The self-reporting assessment tools also poses a potential risk because you worry about the truthfulness of all of the participant sample, all of the samples participants. Also, we look at the DDQ low Chrome box alpha range of 0.66, 0.75. And then finally, we look at the labor intensity of the MI programs. Were the interventionists potentially overworked and not putting in as much effort with the MI programs during their later interactions with the sample population? It is important to look at how these findings affect nurses. So the discovery of the motivational interviewing as an effective technique is extremely beneficial to the field of nursing. It mainly impacts community health center nurses and emergency room staff nurses. We see that if these people can identify students who are at risk for experiencing blackouts secondary to alcohol consumption, something can be done. Allowing nursing professionals to steer the individuals in the right direction by implementing motivation interviewing into practice is going to be beneficial for the field of nursing. It's also important for soon-to-be professionals to be educated on the effectiveness of the MI program so it can be implemented into practice. On conclusion, we see that motivational interviewing decreases the number of drinks consumed, time spent drinking, average number of days and time spent drinking, and blackout rates. We see that there is no link between blackout rates and race and gender. Thank you so much for listening to this research presentation.